Could Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos ever have gotten their device to work if they hadn't been exposed first? Was it even theoretically possible to do what Theranos was trying to do? Yes, actually, it was, and some companies are working on it right now. Could Theranos have done it, though? Definitely not with Elizabeth Holmes in charge. Elizabeth Holmes tried to fake it till she made it. She had promised Walgreens and Safeway a small desktop sized device that could run over 200 tests on just a few drops of blood, wirelessly beam data to a central lab for analysis, and have results beamed back in just a few hours. It would have been a revolutionary change from the current state of testing, which requires large vials of blood to be drawn from the vein, shipped off to a laboratory, analyzed on machines the size of a room, with results requiring up to 2 weeks to get back. But as deadlines for opening Theranos wellness centers approached, Elizabeth Holmes hadn't gotten her device to actually work yet, and she was running out of time and out of money. So she decided to secretly dilute the pinprick samples of blood and run them on commercial machines to buy herself some time to get her device working. But before she could do that, whistleblowers exposed her to regulators and to the press. She has now been convicted of criminal fraud and is facing prison. Could what Holmes promised to do ever even have worked? There were clear challenges from the beginning. Extracting blood from a fingertip requires the fingertip to be milked first, which causes some red blood cells to break, contaminating the blood with tissue and throwing off concentrations of potassium and sodium. Research has shown that concentrations of some solutes can vary significantly from one drop of blood to another. And most types of blood testing techniques that exist today require you to use up some blood as you are testing it, leaving less and less blood for each successive test. Diluting the blood to create more volume makes it harder and harder to detect concentrations of analytes in them if you dilute the blood excessively. What Holmes was trying to do probably would have required groundbreaking progress in a field of science called microfluidics. Microfluidics deals with very tiny volumes of liquid, down to femtoliters or a quadrillionth of a liter. At tiny quantities, fluids behave very differently. They feel more like pudding than water, and the science of manipulating their movement along micrometer-sized channels is a challenge that many scientists are carefully currently working on. Microfluidics would have allowed Theranos to use much smaller sample volumes, helping resolve the volume problem. It could also have theoretically allowed many operations to be executed simultaneously in the same small box due to its reduced size requirements. This kind of technology, which is currently being worked on by numerous scientists and corporations, would have had massive implications not just for blood testing, but for many scientific applications like making microscopic engines. According to Stephen Quake, a bioengineering professor at Stanford and co-president of the Chan Zuckerberg BioHub, who spoke to the Washington Post in November 2021, running numerous tests on tiny drops of blood is theoretically possible, but the scientific industry isn't quite there yet. Quake is also the inventor of Quake microvalves, a tiny pneumatic microvalve that controls liquid flow in microscopic channels that has shown high potential in microfluidic applications. What Holmes was claiming to do would have required her to be much further ahead than anyone else in the industry. Unsurprisingly, many were skeptical that Elizabeth Holmes, a 19-year-old with only 3 semesters of college under her belt, had suddenly made the scientific leaps that would be required for what she was describing. It also didn't help that Theranos refused to publish peer-reviewed studies or let independent scientists test their device. There are companies out there making products that run tests on just a few drops of blood. Some companies innovatively miniaturized current lab testing methods. Even before Theranos existed, a company called Abaxis, which was founded in 1989, was producing a desktop device called the Piccolo, which could run 13 common blood tests on a sample of just 2 to 3 drops of blood and provide results in as little as 12 minutes. Other new startups are exploiting the latest technology to find innovative ways to test blood. As you can imagine, new startups in this field post Theranos are facing immense challenges. People just now automatically associate running multiple tests on a few drops of blood with a scam. These companies have had to go out of their way to be as transparent as possible. A startup called Site Diagnostics can run complete blood counts, or CBCs, on just 2 drops of blood in minutes. A CBC is a blood test that is used to evaluate overall health and detect a wide range of diseases, including anemia, infection, and leukemia. Unusual increases or decreases in your white blood cell count, red blood cell count, hemoglobin, hematocrit, etc., are symptoms indicative of certain illnesses. Site Diagnostics received FDA clearance for use of its technology in non-complex laboratories in 2019. Another company, Carius, can diagnose up to 1,000 different types of infectious diseases from a drop of blood. They do this by searching for foreign DNA in the blood sample, sequencing it, then identifying what species of bacteria, virus, or fungi it belongs to. Carius has openly collaborated with the University of California, San Francisco to produce peer-reviewed studies, and as a symbol of how dedicated they are to transparency, the walls of their lab are literally made of glass. Anyone from the office side can see exactly what their laboratory scientists are doing. Another company, Grail, does something similar for cancer, searching the blood for something called circulating tumor DNA, or ctDNA, a type of DNA sloughed off by cancer cells. They are working on early detection of up to 50 types of cancer. Grail is a spin-off from a larger established company called Illumina, which performed DNA tests on pregnant women to look for any genetic abnormalities in the fetus, like Down syndrome. They noticed that these scans would also sometimes reveal unexplained abnormal DNA belonging to the mother. Women showing these particular abnormalities all later developed cancer, and Grail was founded to turn this technology into an early detection method. Early detection of cancer was one of the things Elizabeth Holmes had claimed that the Theranos device would be able to do. This had really attracted George Shultz, whose first wife had died of pancreatic cancer. Well, there is a company out there that may actually have found a way to do this from a few drops of blood. The British National Health Service, or NHS, is currently performing trials with Grail on over 165,000 patients. Grail raised over $2 billion from investors like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. Last year, it was reacquired by its parent company Illumina for $8 billion. Notice how the companies mentioned so far didn't try to do 200 things on a small sample of blood. Piccolo just focused on doing some of the most common tests. The other companies basically just focused on figuring out how to do one particular thing that could help diagnose a wide range of diseases, whether it was complete blood counts or detecting abnormal DNA. But there are a few companies out there that are basically trying to reproduce Theranos' exact entire plan. Probably the most prominent such company is Genolite, a San Diego-based company founded by a Caltech PhD, which produces a mini fridge-sized device called the Maverick Diagnostic System that is able to do up to 26 blood tests on a single drop of blood in about 30 minutes. They use microfluidic technology that runs the blood over microchips containing sensors designed to bind to different types of analytes, and they can run up to 4 samples at a time. With all the scrutiny created by Theranos, they provide links on their website to all their peer-reviewed studies and regularly ship their products to other institutions like Mayo Clinic and Scripps Clinic allowing them to independently test the device and publish the data themselves. This is highly unusual. Theranos would certainly never let their devices be independently tested for obvious reasons. Holmes would agree with scientists like from Johns Hopkins that she would send their device to them, but then never follow up. So far, several of Gina Light's antibody tests, including a coronavirus test, are FDA approved. And in 2021, they landed $50 million in funding from Verily, a life sciences focused VC firm backed by Google parent company Alphabet. If you recall from our last episode, a Google backed health sciences focused VC firm tried to reach out to Elizabeth Holmes but couldn't get a meeting. She claimed that she just wasn't interested in them, but many believed that she eventually began deliberately avoiding VC firms with healthcare backgrounds because they could possibly have seen through her ruse. Instead, she sought out rich family investors like the DeVosses and the Waltons. So there are companies out there that are trying to do what Theranos set out to do, but none of them are where Elizabeth Holmes falsely claimed she was, running up to 200 tests on just a nanotainer of blood. She would have had to be a real genius to have been so much further ahead than everybody else. If these other companies could create such products, could Theranos have done something similar or even better? Probably not, especially not if Elizabeth Holmes was still in charge. Her management style led to a toxic workplace culture that couldn't even have run a traditional lab properly, and led them down a product development path that was never going to result in a groundbreaking product. The reasons why will be broken down subsequently. But could Theranos have succeeded without Elizabeth Holmes? At one point, the board did decide to oust her as CEO of her own company, which ironically would have given her something in common with her idol Steve Jobs. But she succeeded in changing their minds. If they had ousted her early on, they might have been able to set the ship straight. Theranos' association with people like Larry Ellison, Tim Draper, and Stanford engineering dean Channing Robertson allowed Theranos in its earlier years to hire away employees and executives from companies like Intel, IBM, Apple, and Panasonic, and from biotech companies like Genentech. They were able to hire brilliant, experienced scientists with PhDs from places like Cambridge, MIT, and Stanford. It is unlikely that so many brilliant, experienced scientists would have signed on to something that was a pipe dream. Perhaps they wouldn't have been able to produce Elizabeth's original vision, which was miles ahead of any current technology, but they might have been able to make products similar to, or even more sophisticated than, a company like Genolite was able to. But in later years, when Theranos were already running an elaborate scam with the Walgreens wellness centers, there was probably nothing anyone could have done to set the company straight. Holmes's habit of siloing departments meant that almost no one had a full picture of the extent of the scam other than her, Sunny Balwani, and perhaps their number three, Daniel Young. Her own board didn't even know about the commercial machines. Many employees didn't know about them because they had changed the machine names on the network to hide what kind of machines they were, and they had ordered the people who modified the machines to keep it a secret. Any new executive that replaced Holmes by this point would probably have been shocked and bowled over by the extent of the scam. It was Elizabeth Holmes's leadership in particular that set Theranos down a path that would probably never have led to success. Holmes's fundamental problem was that she derived her entrepreneurial and workplace philosophies from what she read about her Silicon Valley idols like Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison. Employees once joked that you could tell what chapter of Walter Isaacson's Steve Jobs biography Elizabeth was on by what management techniques she was currently experimenting with. The most destructive Silicon Valley philosophies Holmes embraced were the philosophies of fake it till you make it, of never accepting no as an answer in hopes that it will somehow motivate your employees to do the impossible, and of treating anyone who criticized or objected to anything as a disloyal naysayer. She applied these philosophies unwaveringly, ignoring senior executives who would advise her to sometimes do otherwise in certain situations. Holmes was, as New Yorker journalist Ken Oleta has once said, a zealot. She expressed belief that she was building a religion and that anyone who did not show complete faith and loyalty had no place in her company. Holmes's fake it till you make it cost her employees and is eventually what sent her to prison. There was a key early executive, Diane Parks, a biotech industry veteran who had worked for Amgen and Genentech and who was brought into Theranos by chairman of the board, Don Lucas, to serve as adult supervision in the company's early days. Parks was disturbed after seeing Holmes basically tell a pharma executive that the Theranos device could do things it actually couldn't do yet at that point. Elizabeth defended her behavior when confronted by arguing that fake it till you make it was what people like Bill Gates had done. Appalled, Parks argued that it had no place in healthcare. She noted how Holmes seemed to know everything there was to know about those iconic Silicon Valley tech founders like Gates and Jobs, and she doubted that Holmes knew anywhere near as much about healthcare leaders. Parks eventually resigned to protect her own reputation in the industry. In the future, Holmes would also part ways with her CFO, a former Intel executive, after he objected to her fake demos. She would also lose her CCO, whom she had poached from Apple, about disagreements over making testing arrangements with pharma companies before the device was really ready. Several employees resigned when Theranos decided to go live at Walgreens. Former employees who eventually became whistleblowers mostly say they did so out of concern for giving patients bad test results. Basically, like Diane Parks, they didn't think fake it till you make it was acceptable when it came to healthcare. Perhaps if Holmes ran a software company like her Silicon Valley idols, she could have kept employees in line. But messing with patient health was too much for her employees to accept and keep quiet about. We've also seen how Holmes's zealous firing of any employee who expressed doubts or criticism fundamentally transformed the character of her employee pool. Her Cambridge-educated chief scientist was fired, then rehired in a lower position that was basically a desk job after he confided in Channing Robertson that the technology wasn't working. Whistleblowers Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung resigned after they were belittled and excoriated for raising concerns about the company's questionable practices, like their cheating on proficiency tests. Holmes promptly fired any senior executive who raised concerns about her to the board. Many employees simply left because they disliked the environment of intimidation at the company. Within a few years, so many of those experienced scientists were gone, only to be replaced by yes men or by foreign scientists who were afraid to lose their employment visas if they spoke up. All those senior executives she poached from elite companies like Apple and Intel were gone, and her entire senior executive staff had been changed within the first 6 years. Unfortunately, at around this time, Holmes brought in Sunny Balwani, her secret boyfriend, as her number 2 at the company. He became her co-conspirator, devising some of the deceptive practices himself, like the Null Protocol, the software that made Theranos devices look like they were just running slowly when they actually weren't working at all. One of Elizabeth Holmes's college friends, who had worked briefly at Theranos and had worked extensively with Sunny Balwani during that time, said that she felt that Elizabeth Holmes had put herself in some kind of bubble, and unfortunately, the only person she had allowed in there with her was Sunny, a negative influence. Holmes never even bothered to replace some of the executives that left, enabling her and Sunny to further their scam. She never replaced the CFO, so she and Balwani just made up any financial figures they wanted for investors. When their lab director resigned due to ethical concerns, they replaced him with Balwani's dermatologist, who just signed documents without asking questions and admitted he only ever visited Theranos' office 2 or 3 times. Lab director was one of the highest paid positions at the company, which did, after all, provide lab test results to patients, and yet their lab essentially had no leader. Holmes's attempt to mimic her idol Steve Jobs' management techniques also set Theranos down a device development path that was doomed to failure. To understand this, it is important to understand that there were three versions of the Theranos device. The first version, Theranos 1.0, was based on that groundbreaking science of microfluidics, running microscopic quantities of liquid down microscopic channels lined with wells filled with antigens that the blood reacted with. If the technology Theranos wanted was ever going to work, it would probably have had to be done through breakthrough microfluidics technology that they would have had to develop themselves. But the Theranos 1.0 machine struggled. The chief engineer couldn't tell if the microfluidics technology was the problem or if the chemistry was the problem, because the chemistry and the engineering departments weren't allowed to speak to each other, and no one was put in charge of testing the overall system. Holmes claimed she siloed the different departments in order to keep the company in stealth mode. It left her as the only person with the full picture of the state of the technology, which meant that no other employee could run off with Theranos' IP. But it also hampered productivity and frustrated employees. The chief engineer did believe that they could get the device to work if they could just use more blood. But Holmes was committed to the optics of a small quantity of blood and would not compromise. She believed that refusing to compromise would encourage her scientists to find breakthrough solutions. After all, this is what Larry Ellison and Steve Jobs did. Rather than listen to her chief engineer, she decided to employ a strategy known to be used by Steve Jobs. She set up another engineering team and pitted them against each other to see who would come up with a device that worked. The rival engineering team devised a device based on a robotic arm used by a glue dispensing machine. Employees called the new device the GlueBot. It worked by imitating a human arm at a lab bench, pipetting liquid or reagents from one place and moving them to another, mixing them with reagents. At that stage, the GlueBot was actually working and the microfluidics machine was not. So Holmes fired the microfluidics team and decided to go with the GlueBot, which he named the Edison. So the Edison was the Theranos 2.0 machine. By choosing the Edison, Theranos had chosen technology that was not at all groundbreaking or even new. They had simply taken methods from the lab bench that had been around for decades, miniaturized them, and put them in a box. Some employees described being underwhelmed when they finally saw the inside of an Edison machine, saying it looked like a high school science project. Whistleblower Tyler Scholes said there was nothing the Edison could do that he couldn't do with his own hands sitting at a lab bench. Shanak Roy, a Stanford PhD who had worked with Elizabeth in Channing Robertson's lab and become Theranos' first employee, resigned from Theranos at this point because it was no longer the groundbreaking technology he thought he would be working on. What wasn't clear at that point was that choosing the Edison might have set Theranos down a product development path that was doomed to fail. The Edison could only do one of four categories of blood tests, the immunoassay. Theranos set about designing a third iteration of the machine, the Theranos 3.0 machine, which they called the Mini Lab. The Mini Lab was supposed to be able to do all four categories of tests. Until this point, Theranos had actually been making pretty fast progress. The Theranos 1.0 machine had been developed in about 3 years. The Theranos 2.0 machine, the Edison, was designed in less than 6 months. There was no reason for Elizabeth to believe they wouldn't keep making progress. So Elizabeth went about signing deals with Walgreens and Safeway with the expectations that when the wellness centers opened in a couple of years, the Theranos 3.0 device would be ready. But we all know by now what happened. They weren't ready. Over time, it became evident that there were a lot of problems with the GlueBot design Holmes had chosen, problems that microfluidics would likely not have had. For example, the GlueBot required pipettes while the microfluidics machine did not. The pipettes drifted over time and had to be recalibrated every few months. The recalibration process took 5 whole days, during which time the machine could not be used. The pipettes also often wouldn't suck up all the blood from their little containers, leaving some blood at the bottom and wasting already very tiny portions. Often the pipettes would just break. Some engineers suggested they should imitate a more reliable design, like that of the piccolo, that device we mentioned earlier that had been around for a while. The piccolo didn't use pipettes, but it could only run a limited range of tests. And Elizabeth wanted a device that could run the complete range of tests, so the engineers decided against this design. The Theranos device components were also overly sensitive to temperature. Sometimes they overheated. Sometimes, when it was too cold outside, they wouldn't get warm enough. They could only test one sample at a time, which could result in long lines if a pharmacy or clinic was ever busy. But attempts to stack multiple devices on top of each other so that they could do more than one test at a time led to overheating. Recall that the Genolite microfluidics-based device we mentioned earlier could handle up to 4 samples at a time because it was dealing with much smaller volumes. Abandoning microfluidics would also mean using larger volumes of blood per test, and each test would consume a little blood, leaving less and less blood available for subsequent tests. Plus, the engineers were having trouble fitting components for all 4 types of blood tests in the desktop-sized container Holmes wanted. The chief engineer suggested to Holmes that maybe the mini lab could fit all the components for the different types of tests if they just built a bigger machine. For now, he said, they should focus on building a machine that worked and focus on miniaturizing it later. But Holmes, as usual, stuck with her Steve Jobs-like never taking no for an answer philosophy and would not budge from her vision of a small device. It is questionable if Holmes could ever have run any type of company effectively. Even when Holmes attempted to run a standard lab, she failed to provide decent results. Theranos, if you recall from our last episode, began providing blood tests for Safeway's employee clinic, and the chief medical officer grew suspicious about how they were taking both full venous blood draws and pinprick samples from employees, and how they were providing such faulty responses that the tests often had to be retested somewhere else. He also noticed that Theranos farmed out some of their tests to a third-party company, and the third-party company's results were much more accurate than Theranos's. Well, Theranos wasn't even running the Safeway employees' blood tests on their Edisons. The lab where they were sending them did not even contain a single Edison device. They were doing nothing but standard tests on standard quantities of venous blood on standard commercial machines. Yet they were still messing it up. Poorly trained employees were not spinning down the blood enough, leading to samples that were contaminated with particulate matter. Lab techs used expired blood drawing tubes containing ineffective anticoagulants. When one lab tech wrote a memo listing all the improper procedures that were going on at the lab, she was fired for it. It's hard to imagine how a company where employees couldn't speak up if things were not being done properly could possibly have been effective. Shortly before the Wall Street Journal article came out, the CMS ran a surprise inspection based on a tip from whistleblower Erica Chung. They found that even Theranos' standard labs were subpar. In the end, perhaps the most convincing evidence that Holmes would never have gotten the Theranos device to work was the years and years the mini lab spent in development without ever being successful. By the time the Walgreens Wellness Centers opened, the mini lab had been in development for 2.5 years. By the time the Wall Street Journal expose came out 2 years later, the mini lab was still in development. In the summer of 2016, less than a year after the Wall Street Journal article came out, Elizabeth Holmes was still putting on a defiant act, attending conferences and defending her technology, saying that the Wall Street Journal article was full of inaccuracies. She signed up to make a presentation of the mini lab at the American Association for Clinical Chemistry annual meeting in August 2016. Her presentation would supposedly reveal how her device worked. There was a lot of excitement surrounding the demonstration, and it attracted several dozen journalists. Board members who still believed in Elizabeth, like George Shultz, thought she would prove all the naysayers wrong at this presentation. But instead, she gave a presentation that was underwhelming. She presented data for only 11 blood tests that were done mostly on venous blood, not finger pricks. The data wasn't independently verified or peer reviewed. The presentation did nothing to prove that her company could do what it claimed. In January 2018, Theranos published a peer reviewed study in a scientific journal, Bioengineering and Translational Medicine. The study finally compared her technology to standard FDA approved machines. But it only tested venous blood, not finger prick samples, and only included a handful of tests. It also exposed the fact that the Theranos device still couldn't do all 4 types of tests in one box. It had to be reconfigured with new components whenever they needed to do a different type of test. As bizarrely confident as Holmes was acting, the 2016 presentation and the 2018 study were simply proof that by 2018, Theranos was nowhere near being able to do what they claimed they could do back in 2013. A few months after the study was published, Theranos would close its doors forever. Elizabeth Holmes had created an environment where she couldn't see the destructiveness of her own actions because she had fired anyone who was willing to point them out and allowed only Sunny Balwani, her enabler, in her isolation bubble. Her refusal to ever compromise on her vision meant she kept refusing to explore the suggestions of her own chief engineers and senior executives, suggestions that could possibly have produced some sort of working product. In the end, it's hard to believe that Elizabeth's leadership style could ever have succeeded. I hope you enjoyed this episode. In the next episode, I'm going to leave Theranos for a while and talk about another scandal that the Theranos scandal reminded me of. A scandal that feels old now, but actually took place just a year before the Theranos scandal broke. It's the 2014 scandal of Japanese stem cell scientist Haruko Obokata, which was a big deal in the scientific community back then, and basically in the whole of Japan, where she remains a kind of pseudo-celebrity. There were so many parallels to the Holmes story. A young, attractive woman who had supposedly made a scientific breakthrough. Older males completely taken with her. Doctored documents, or in Obokata's case, doctored images in her documents, and even the suicide of an older male scientific mentor. There were whispers of a Nobel Prize in Obokata's future until it was all exposed as a big lie. If you enjoyed this episode, please support the channel by liking and subscribing, and thank you for listening to this YouTube-only podcast, Scandalcast.